Welcome to Kitchen Conversations. I am Representative April Berg, and I am so excited to have you join me in my kitchen. Today, we have an amazing and much anticipated episode with the podcaster, author extraordinaire, DB Crema. She does the podcast United States of Race. It's a podcast about how our earliest experiences shape our identities and relationships for the rest of our lives. It is literally one of my favorite podcasts. So I have to admit up front, I'm a complete fangirl. And DB, she's a writer, she's a researcher, she's a peace practitioner, and she does this on topics of race, society, conflict resolution, human rights, and sustainability. I am so excited to have her here with me in my kitchen today because she is just as passionate as I am about exploring the dynamics of human interaction and using the power of storytelling to build connections and build bridges. So, with that, I'm going to give it over to DB Crema to let her talk a little bit about herself and some of the great work she's doing.
Thank you so much, April. It is such a pleasure to be here. I am always so impressed with your tireless work in community building and social justice. So it's my honor to join you and to be invited onto Kitchen Conversations today. And I'm super excited to talk about the podcast United States of Race. As you mentioned, I also, for the past 18 years, have been working on sustainability and conflict resolution. And I really kind of geek out on looking at how societies contract and come together around issues that divide us and that connect us. And sometimes those are the same issues. So I guess that's kind of where United States of Race came out of, the podcast itself. So super excited to talk to you about it today.
Yeah, well, and thank you for that because that kind of tees up my first question. And that's about just the podcast itself. What's it about? And I am interested, kind of as that fangirl, of how did you come up with this concept of using storytelling to talk about race?
Right. Yeah. Okay, the show is about race. It's about experiencing race in America from our earliest childhood memories to how it affects our current social and political views. And it's interview style. I usually have one guest on each episode. Normally they're anonymous, although we do have some featured guests. And when we talk and really what it's about is like when we talk about race, we each come from these well-entrenched positions, each of us representing our unique perspective, different from anyone else around the world. And usually we feel like, oh, this is like exactly what we feel and we'll never change our opinion on it. But the reality is that most of us are taught about race at such an early age, we may not even realize when our opinions on the topic were first formed, or the ways that those influences over time have impacted how we navigate relationships today and for the rest of our lives. So what I found in this podcast is that all of us, talking about what divides us and connects us, all of us had to be taught about race at some point early on, right? So as kids, we're capable of seeing that people are different colors, different shapes, different sizes, but it's not until we're told that we should make distinctions based on those that we start to look at it through that lens. And what I found actually in talking with people is that most were actually confused when they first heard about it. Like, what about what? Why? Right. So it was really fascinating to kind of dive into that. And where it came from was last year, starting in June, after the murder of George Floyd, I ended up facilitating some conversations. Sorry, my dogs always love to join the conversation.
No worries. We love dogs and kids at Kitchen Conversations. That's why we're in the kitchen.
It's fitting. I was facilitating some conversations about race within my professional network, and I posed the question to a group of women from all backgrounds, this question of, okay, talk about a very early experience, a very early memory about race, not necessarily racism, that impacted or influenced how you navigate any relationships or situations that have to do with race today. And I was driven to bring that question up because I started to hear not intentional, but a lot of anti-Black sentiment in my professional conversations in my professional setting. And I started to realize this is coming from deeply ingrained influences, right? It's
Mhm.
not that people are
Mhm.
intentionally trying to uh, um, replicate or continually say these anti-Black sentiments or anti-Black Indigenous people of color sentiments. It's that this kind of deeply rooted bigotry kind of sits, its
Yeah.
socialization sits within all of us. So that's where it came from.
Yeah.
The conversation in this sharing among the group, um, it created this connection among everyone, like that we started to realize, oh, we understand each other better. You know, it's professional setting, so most of us don't know that much about each other, but it created this connection. You could kind of feel this palpable but intangible sense of connection across the group. And I sat with that for a while and I thought about, well, what do I do with that? And my husband actually was the one who suggested, you should make a podcast, let people tell their story. And I was like, I don't know anything about
Love that.
podcasting. So that's clearly not going to happen. And then I Googled how to make a podcast and I followed steps 1 through 12. And then I had a podcast. So here we
Wow.
are.
Wow. Like how to bake a cake. It's just how to
Right.
do a podcast.
Nailed it.
That's so awesome. Well, and honestly, you did nail it. And I love, first off, I love everything about it, right? So your theme music, it's soothing. And your first question, you asked the first question, same question of all your guests, which is when did you become aware of race? And I think to your previous point, it's not a question about racism and when did you become aware of racism, but when did you become aware of race? And I think that's important because there is that moment that really does infect or reflect and affect the rest of our lives when and how we become aware of race. So, thinking about some of your episodes and some of the answers that I've heard, I guess, why do you start with that question? And has that kind of evolved throughout the last few episodes?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. You know, it's interesting, particularly over the past year, while there's this growing awareness and in the country, and the podcast does focus on the U.S. experience, but while there's this growing
Mhm.
awareness, and in fact, there seems to be more people who are becoming involved and who are working to understand their own personal role in becoming less racist.
Mhm.
While there's
Mhm.
more focus on it, our country seems to be becoming more divided by the topic of race and racism. So,
Yeah.
in some respects, the show is about race, but it's not. You know, on a higher level, it's really about how our early experiences and interactions shape our identities, our relationships, our social and political views, our egos. It's really about
Mhm.
how other people's ideas, generations of people's ideas, passed on to us, taught to
Mhm.
us, imposed upon us, they
Mhm.
become the filter through which we see our view our own lives and see the world around us. So basically, it's kind of uncovering for each of us that we're really just a derivation of the past. Each of us, we
Yeah.
like to think that what we believe and what we think is based on our own, independent thought and hard evidence, but it's really based
Mhm.
on generations of input. And so that was the reason for focusing in on that first question of, early experience. And because it's in the power of storytelling that you really start to
Yeah.
draw other people in, right? So
Mhm.
you'll note that, well, it's actually off camera or off recording. I usually ask people to talk about, in talking about that experience, how did it feel? How did it taste?
Mhm.
How did it smell? What was the day like? Who was there? Who wasn't there? What did they
Oh,
say?
interesting.
Really diving into that emotional aspect that is so key to rich
Yeah.
storytelling on a kind of
Mhm.
basic level. But it's really about drawing people in, creating
Yeah.
emotion, and helping, I guess it gets to the aims of the show, which is broadening people's perspectives by pushing them to kind of try to put themselves in
Yep.
your shoes and question their own assumptions. So it's
And it's visceral.
Yeah.
It's that visceral. When you're talking about senses and taste and smell, it's that visceral reaction that you have to understanding or experiencing race, either be
Mhm.
it your own race or another race for the first time. So
Mhm.
that comes out. So even though that's off camera, let me tell you, in your podcast, that visceral nature really does come across.
And some of
And
them
I
are
and it kind of,
hilarious, right? And some
yeah,
of them are
right. No,
heartbreaking.
that's what I was going to say, the diversity of your guests. And I have to ask you, because there's some episodes that really do stick with me, and I know we've talked off camera about some of them. If one we won't dive into, but Heinz 57, you have an episode about Heinz 57, and I was like, I'll never look at ketchup the same. But the one that I'm thinking of right now, in terms of that diversity of guests and the power of storytelling, and having storytelling being that catalyst for having difficult conversations around race. I'm thinking about, you had a Black woman, an African American woman on your show that is a Trump supporter. I don't know how else to say it, and you really had that deft
Yes.
Oprah style interview technique. I thought you knew that was coming. You told me you didn't know that was coming. I listened to that episode and literally like dropped my coffee because I didn't see it coming. And just for viewers out there who haven't listened to the podcast, you start off very much into that storytelling, that richness of why and how race has been internalized in your interviewee's life. And
Mhm.
so as a listener, I'm invested in all of your guests and all of their origin stories. And then you do get to a certain point, and especially in that episode, where you kind of maybe see different paths taken because of that internalization of race or racism. So just talk to me a little bit about that diversity. And if you want, you can talk to me about that episode, because it was jaw
So
dropping.
right. Well, goodness. I mean, if if that's not a
Yeah.
reminder that I need to be testing my own assumptions, because to be honest, I went into that episode making absolutely opposite assumptions about what the conversation would be and what the
Hmm.
guest's viewpoint was. And so in the middle of it, I asked a second time, kind of led into that saying the
Yeah.
question of just to understand what her political and social beliefs are, because I doubted that I had heard it properly. I was so shocked
Yeah.
because I was so convinced that I knew what this person was going to think. And, we hear it all the time. The Black community is not a monolith, or any particular
Yeah.
community is not a monolith. And it's true on so many levels, because everybody has such a different experience and it's so nuanced. And until we start
Yeah.
to meet each other and understand each other on that level, it's really, I mean, talking about difficult conversations, you think about, being at the holiday dinner table and a tough subject comes up, and
Hmm.
all of a sudden discussion gets heated and facts and figures start flying around, some correct and some not. And cheeks start to get flushed, and everyone starts making accusations towards each other. And when you think about trying to broaden somebody else's perspective, two things definitely do not work.
Hmm.
Telling people that they're wrong and
Yeah.
focusing on convincing them that you're right. It
Yeah.
just doesn't work ever. I mean, I
Yeah.
don't know
But
anyone
never
who,
successful.
yeah, tell me, please let me know of anyone who has had made that work at the Thanksgiving dinner table. So, it's like when we're focusing on trying to broaden other people's perspectives or bring them along, particularly on the topic of race and anything that intersects with politics and society, it requires us to focus on building a better understanding through connections. And that's
Hmm.
why, we're focused on the storytelling. Um, and I think that with the podcast, using the voice as part of the story is
Yeah.
critical. And I usually try to make the episodes anonymous because I think that it's a way to get people to open up, and
Yeah.
and it's also a way to get the listener to listen without prejudice. We remove all the
Mhm.
superficial traits and factors that trigger our biases when we can see things about a
Yep.
person. And we have to just listen to what the person is saying and be led along the story that they want to tell.
And
So,
that's huge, because I was thinking of another episode where I made an assumption, and that was your Storm the Capitol episode. And the gentleman that you were interviewing, I did not think was a Black gentleman
Oh yeah.
at the beginning based on his voice. And honestly, and so I had to check some assumptions. But the big thing about that, to kind of juxtapose that with the Black Trump supporter, this Black gentleman had been raised in an all white family,
Right.
and it really, spoke to how the privilege of his family didn't transfer to himself. So just for
Mhm.
those of you who haven't heard that episode, and he, quite frankly, was just done. Right? He's like, I'm done. I've been on this earth 40 some years and I'm done. And he had seen it all, been through it all, seen the privilege of his parents and seen the lack thereof within his life. And now he's raising kids. And I could hear and feel his exasperation by the end of that episode. That said, the assumption may be, right, you might have flip-flopped those guests to say he might have been raised by this white family in this predominantly white area, and he might have been leaning more conservative, whereas he was just
Right.
done and like, tell me, the revolution will not be televised. Give me the intersection, I will be there. Whereas you
Right.
had this, this woman who was raised in an all Black area, and really came out with a much different experience. So I guess talk to me about that in terms of, your style and talking about the United States of race. You've, I think, had every race on your show, talking about how that is. And I guess how has that happened? How has that storytelling happened with the diversity of guests that you've had?
Right. Yeah. Admittedly, some of them are my friends, and I've lived a lot of places
You've
around the
got
country.
amazing friends, yeah.
I do. I have amazing friends. Amazing for entertaining me on my endeavors. And I should say that we had the first of 15 episodes. The spring season is still online and accessible anywhere you get your podcasts. The fall season will be starting about mid-September, so I'm super excited to bring you more stories. I feel so honored that so many people have entrusted me with their personal stories
Yeah.
to be able to share it with everyone. And so some are friends. I've also reached out to various organizations that are doing a lot of social justice work to reach some populations that I just haven't had the reach with. And so it's kind of friends of friends, social network, putting out calls. The woman that you referenced at the beginning, who is a Black woman who's a Trump supporter, reached out to the United States of Race and
Mhm.
said she wanted to be on the show.
Oh, that's
So it's a
awesome.
variety of people. Um, and and again, it gets back to this piece about, really, if we're going to talk about unity,
Yeah,
and conflict and addressing conflict, it needs to be brought down to the personal. And one of the
absolutely.
things I wanted to talk to you about, April, is like, to be very clear, ending racism is not accomplished by personalizing everything and focusing on the individual. And so that's,
Thank you for that. Thank
yeah,
you for
and
saying
that's
that. Yeah,
one of
saying
the
that
things
out
that
loud.
I'm always just so amazed at the work that you're doing. And I actually oftentimes am concerned that my show focusing on that, if anything, it only serves to further the idea that racism um, is not on a systems level.
Mhm,
You know,
mhm.
because it's this individual experience as well, which of course is not true. The truth is that
Yeah,
these two things exist at the same time: one's personal experiences as well as the systemic issues.
exactly,
And that's
exactly.
why I thought I grapple with, but I thought it was very important to also center the experience of white guests, you know, because
Yeah,
race and societal issues is an experience that everyone has. And if we're going to ever come together, we have to
exactly.
address it. But it's, issues like voter suppression, police brutality, wage differences, real
Yeah,
issues that have to be addressed. These are like
absolutely.
organizational,
And
governmental,
climate. Yeah,
climate require
climate.
systemic
You've got a
change.
great episode on climate. I
On
thought that
climate.
was
Oh, wonderful.
completely amazing to do that intersection. And I think for me, so just the takeaways, right? So
Yeah.
you've had a lot of these great conversations. And so what are some of your takeaways? But I'm going to kind of, before you answer that piece of it, I want to know for myself and for my, I guess I know the answer to this question, but for my viewers to know the answer, how do you identify yourself when someone asks you about your race? How do you identify?
The big question that I always,
Yes.
I literally just like tense up when people ask me that, when strangers ask me that. Are you mixed? Are you, what are you? What are you? Like as if I'm
Yeah.
an object. Um,
Yeah.
so I have, and because I've always had that difficulty, and because I have always been had challenged figuring out what box to check, if you will, like on the census or
Mhm.
test taking and such, I've always referenced the multicultural, the multinational aspects of my family. I'm first generation American, and my mom's from the Caribbean, and my dad is from Europe, and that's again, that's the way that
Mhm.
I talk about myself. And when it comes to it, down to it, I'm biracial, I'm black and white.
Mhm.
And mostly, yeah, I think there's probably some other things in there. But again,
Exactly.
I hesitate to talk about to feel like I can claim a community and to talk about who I am, because I'm always tempering it with how I think other people see me and what their
Yeah.
expectations are of how I should talk about myself. And I think that's really, it gets down to this issue of, addressing systemic racism needs to be done while also addressing the individual or our individual experiences and
Mhm.
sharing those to help build this understanding that they can
Mhm.
really to get at the things that go unchallenged within us,
Yeah.
and how that ends up leading to this need to or how addressing that, or and it really is intentionally trying to push the boundaries of our thinking and our how our opinions are
Absolutely.
formed. So, on that sense though, like who I can say who I am, a
Mhm.
couple of things that I really found interesting from the show. One is I've like the very episode 15, Holly, she talks about this
Love Holly. Yeah.
grappling with reconciling how she sees herself and versus how the rest of the world sees her, and almost this difficulty of claiming her black heritage, because
Mhm.
she knows that, as she says, when I walk down the street, no one thinks, oh, hey, there goes a black girl. And so in some
Yeah.
respects she hesitates to feel connected to that community. She hesitates to feel like she belongs and is accepted within that community. And
Yeah.
it's really kind of figuring out what that means. And it's also, I've talked with white people who are categorized as white, or maybe
Yeah.
whose skin color is white, but for various reasons, like Russian Jewish immigrant to the
Yes.
US, or an Arab man who has darker skin, they have not lived the experience of a white person in this country. And so they also have this difficulty of talking, or the dissonance between, you
Yeah.
know, how people see them and who they feel comfortable being in this country. And so in a lot
Yeah.
of ways, it impacts not only how we relate to each other, but imagine how much self-negation goes on, that kind of deeply
Absolutely.
ingrained feelings of not fitting and not being able to claim certain things.
Well, and it's that dissonance that you talked about, and I think that's huge. And full disclosure, me and DB have been friends for a long time, and so, race does often come up in our families. And I think that that episode that you were referring to with Holly really resonated with me. So I'm a Black woman who often gets mistaken for being biracial, and I am always amazed because to me I don't look biracial at all. I just look like my parents and my grandparents and my great grandparents, and we're all the exact same color, and we can unpack the history of that on a whole nother episode. But I do have a white passing daughter. And that episode really spoke to the challenges she has with checking the box, what box to check, what box people put her in. And also, the best thing that Holly said was the great reveal when she's around people who are speaking out of line about Black folks and people of color, and they don't know she's Black. And then she gets to do the great reveal of, guess what?
Aha.
You've been talking to a Black person this whole time, and you have been talking sideways, and shame on you. And so I'm sure it's more colorful than that. But that is kind of what we call her superpower. But it shows like yours that you've said so eloquently. It's an and both, right? It's not an either or. It's not either personal storytelling about race or systemic racism and talking about that. It's and both. We have to have both of those pieces. And so your platform provides it in an absolutely amazing way. So I can't thank you enough. And but I have to ask you one last question before I let you go, which I really don't want to let you go. What's your moonshot? I asked this, you're in my kitchen. I've been talking a lot this season about these moonshots. And again, for viewers who are just tuning in, that moonshot is something that you think is impossible, but now we realize is completely necessary. And that's for a variety of reasons, anything from COVID to being in this social justice racial reckoning moment. But what would be your moonshot for the United States of race?
Honestly, okay, one of the other takeaways from the show is about white privilege and the difficulty
Mm,
that white people have in holding space for systemic racism as it relates, again, coming back to that systems
mhm.
versus individual. How can systemic racism exist? Or what about my difficulties
Yeah,
and in relation to BIPOC experiencing systemic inequality and vice versa? How can it be
mhm.
if there's rich Black people that systemic
Yeah,
racism exists? And I think a lot of it is this challenge of holding space for both, understanding that they can both exist, as well as the challenge of people having to, if white people admit to systemic racism, it requires of them then to hold a mirror up to themselves to see how they've benefited from it.
yeah,
Um, and and then also gets into a whole lot of colorism things around privilege. But the moonshot
yeah,
is admittedly, I think everyone should listen to United States of Race. I think it can bring value to everyone in terms of self-reflection. And my moonshot is really, how do I get those who most need to hear the show to hear
yeah,
it? And it's
yeah,
admittedly it's the audience, the group of people who aren't going to be the ones logging into this conversation today, who aren't going to be the
yeah,
ones who are going to listen to the podcast and say, oh, I could find value in that. And I think in that respect, it's kind of slowly kind of trying to work through various organizations to help bring the message in a different way that's maybe more
yeah.
palatable.
No, and that is a moonshot, right? I mean, just getting the message out to the folks who need it. So hopefully platforms like this, hopefully, I can't wait for the fall season to come out. It's going to be incredible because you've already had some incredible guests and I've learned so much. So your moonshot, I think is going to be, you're going to land it. You're
Oh,
absolutely going to land it. So
I hope with all of our work combined and all of the amazing
yeah.
people we're both working with, we can land that moonshot.
Absolutely. Well, it has been an absolute pleasure to talk with you, DB. I love the work you're doing. I've loved our friendship for I think it's almost been 20 years now. I can only do the math via my kids' ages. So, but I just love that you are always kind of my true north when it comes to issues around peace, justice, race, sustainability. You have a way of bringing all of it together that's just so incredible. So just thank you for the work you're doing, and thank you for the work you're going to be doing in your next season. So with
Thank you.
that, everyone. Yeah, no, it's been fabulous. Everyone, I just want you to tune in next week. I love having guests like DB Crema. I love all of my guests here in Kitchen Conversations. Next week, we're going to have the amazing Melissa Duque. She is running for Mill Creek City Council, but she's going to be here talking with us about local governments supporting local business. Let me say that again. Local government supporting local business. That is
Yeah.
so important right now in all of our lives and all of our communities. Tune in right here next Tuesday at 3 p.m. Until then, have a great rest of your week.